Today, there are 10 countries that have developed nuclear weapons capable of destroying the world. Some did it through forced alliances, others by spying and betraying. But it all begins with a country, a secret project, and a race against time. In 1938, German scientists discovered that an atom could be split, releasing a colossal energy through a chain reaction. They had found nuclear fission, a phenomenon that would change the planet's fate. They were playing with fire, and soon they would pay dearly. The following year, Einstein, concerned about the destructive potential of this discovery, sent an urgent letter to President Roosevelt. The message was clear: if you don't act now, someone else will. The government took note, and while the Second World War was devastating Europe, the United States embarked on a secret project that would consume 1% of its gross domestic product. They called it the Manhattan Project, but they didn't do it alone. Scientists from the United Kingdom and Canada also participated, all focused on the same goal: to create the most powerful weapon on the planet before the Germans. Germany didn't lag behind, and as Einstein warned, started its own nuclear program. But before it could progress too much, the first major twist happened. In May 1945, the Nazis surrendered. But in July, while American President Truman was meeting with Stalin and Churchill in Potsdam to decide the future of Germany, something else was happening. At that precise moment, Truman received a direct call from the New Mexico desert. That's where they conducted the first test of the atomic bomb, and it had been a resounding success. The United States already had the bomb, and the tension was immediate. Truman hinted to Stalin with ambiguous phrases such as, "someone who wants to show power without revealing too much." But Stalin already knew. He had spies inside the Manhattan Project, and that silent betrayal infuriated him internally. Even so, it did not stop him. 1 month later, the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan's surrender was almost immediate. The Americans laughed and went on with their lives without imagining what was coming. Because what seemed like the end of the conflict was actually the beginning of something much bigger. A global race to match or surpass the power that the United States had just demonstrated. And the first to respond would be its own most distrustful ally, the Soviet Union, which when it saw with its own eyes the power of the bombs dropped by the United States and Japan, there was no turning back. The Soviets accelerated their research like never before. They had something others did not: a deeply infiltrated espionage network in the US nuclear project. They obtained data, plans, and key technical advances. But there was a problem. They feared that this information was fake, sent by double agents to sabotage them from within. They decided not to trust blindly and did the work twice. On one hand, they built a bomb based on the stolen designs, and on the other hand, they conducted their own independent research, even using German scientists captured after the war. The combination was effective. In 1949, much earlier than the United States imagined, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. That day, the world stopped having a single nuclear superpower, and the Cold War had just begun. And with it, an arms race without precedent in human history. United Kingdom. One would think that among allies there are no secrets, that if one country shares intelligence, the other will respond with gratitude. But in the nuclear game, there are no friendships. Great Britain was, in fact, one of the pioneers in nuclear research. In 1940, while struggling to survive the German bombings, he launched his own program, Tube Alloys. There they gathered British, German, Austrian, and Polish scientists, many of whom were fleeing from Nazism. But due to the lack of resources and the urgency of the war, the United Kingdom decided to hand over all its research to the United States, merging it with the Manhattan Project under the so-called Quebec Agreement. That agreement promised that both countries would share the final discoveries, and more importantly, that they would never use those weapons against each other. But when they finally developed the bomb in 1945, the United States broke the deal without warning. They didn't share the results or allow access to the technology. They kept it all. So Great Britain, betrayed but determined, resumed their program on their own and had something very valuable on their side. They controlled most of the world's uranium. Thanks to that, and the fact that they already had much of the work advanced, They managed to successfully complete their first test in 1952, known as Operation Hurricane. The detonation took place on the Montebello Islands, north of Australia. With that, the United Kingdom became the third country in the world with nuclear weapons and also the first to have been betrayed by its best ally. But it would not be the last. France did not want to be left behind. After all, it had already contributed scientists to the Manhattan Project itself. But after the war and with Europe in ruins, its focus shifted mainly to nuclear energy, until something changed. In 1956, the humiliation Suez crisis happened. France, along with the United Kingdom and Israel, attempted to regain control of the Suez Canal in Egypt. But the United States and the Russians intervened diplomatically, and France was left sidelined. That moment marked a before and after. The French leaders understood that if they wanted to be considered a great power again, they could not depend on anyone. They needed their own deterrent capability, and that meant one thing: nuclear weapons. President Charles de Gaulle personally led this decision. He declared that a sovereign France must be able to defend itself alone, even from its own allies if necessary. This meant distancing from NATO and American supervision. France, without access to Anglo-Saxon information, had to develop its arsenal almost completely independently. But they had something that would be key: natural uranium from their colonies in Niger, Gabon, and Madagascar. With this resource, and despite being economically devastated, the French scientists worked tirelessly. In 1960, in the middle of the Sahara Desert, within the territory of the French colony of Algeria, they carried out their first successful nuclear test. It was the country's first nuclear explosion, and the most powerful ever conducted by a nation on their first attempt up to that point. But they didn't stop there. In 1968, France also detonated its first hydrogen bomb, marking its full entry into the exclusive club of nuclear superpowers. They did it on their own, without relying on anyone. And that's why, since then, their strategy has been clear: total strategic independence. China was initially seen by the Soviet Union as a promising ally during the Cold War. Both nations shared a communist ideology and a deep distrust of the West. So, at first, the Soviets offered their help generously. During the 1950s, the Soviet Union shared with China materials, technical knowledge, and assistance in nuclear development. It seemed that the Asian giant was on its way to having its own bomb, with Moscow's full support. But then something broke. When Nikita Khrushchev started his de-Stalinization process, the Chinese leader Mao Zedong saw it as an ideological betrayal. He considered that the new Soviet direction was too soft on capitalism, a sign of weakness. The relationship between both powers deteriorated rapidly. In retaliation, Khrushchev ordered the immediate withdrawal of all Soviet aid to the Chinese nuclear program. China was left alone, but instead of giving up, it doubled down. During the Great Leap Forward and the instability of the Cultural Revolution, the communist regime decided to prioritize the development of nuclear weapons. Above all else, they invested enormous resources, even as millions of citizens starved. And they achieved something extraordinary. In 1964, China detonated its first atomic bomb in the desert region of Lop Nur. The whole world was surprised, but that was not all. Only 32 months later, China succeeded in testing its first hydrogen bomb, becoming the fastest country to transition from atomic fission bombs to thermonuclear fusion bombs. And he did it without external help. From that moment, the Chinese doctrine was clear: an independent, deterrent nuclear force aimed at resisting pressure from both the West and its former Soviet allies. Israel has one of the most secretive and yet revealing histories in global nuclear development. No country has been as ambiguous or as calculated with its nuclear program as Israel. To this day, it has never officially admitted to having nuclear weapons. Nor has it denied having them. They simply do not talk about it. But the story behind it is anything but silent. Since the 1950s, Israel secretly collaborated with France, sharing research and scientific talent. Thanks to that agreement, the French helped build a covert nuclear facility in the middle of the Negev desert near the city of Dimona. Officially, it was a research center for energy. Unofficially, things were very different. In 1963, the then United States President Kennedy began to seriously suspect that Israel was developing nuclear weapons, demanded full access to the facility to confirm its use was purely peaceful. But Israel did not yield. For years, they allowed only inspections carefully guided by false routes. They even hid underground tunnels where the real operations were conducted out of the inspector's sight. Internally, the Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, was obsessed with acquiring the bomb. He saw it as an absolute guarantee of survival for the country, surrounded by enemies since its inception. This strained relations with the United States, and although Kennedy strongly pressured, his assassination that same year changed everything. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, took a much more relaxed stance, and the Israeli program continued without major obstacles. It is believed that Israel managed to develop nuclear weapons around 1967, although it was not until 1986 that the world had the first major confirmation, and not through diplomatic means. That year, an Israeli technician named Mordechai Benunu, who had worked at the Dimona facility, fled the country and leaked a huge amount of documents and photographs to the British press. The evidence was undeniable. Israel had an active nuclear arsenal, and it was suspected that it included thermonuclear weapons, not just atomic ones. But the story doesn't end there. Benunu was tricked by a Mossad agent who lured him to Rome under the false promise of a romantic date. There, he was kidnapped, drugged, and secretly transported back to Israel. He was tried behind closed doors. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison for espionage and treason, of which he spent more than a decade in solitary confinement. Until today, he lives under severe restrictions. He cannot leave the country, speak to the press, or go near sensitive areas. And although Israel still does not officially confirm its program, the Benunu case and the systematic silence surrounding it speak for themselves. India has always been interested in nuclear energy. Since the 40s, it has worked on reactors and atomic technology, but with a supposedly peaceful goal to produce energy, not weapons. But there was a problem. India was surrounded by dangerous rivals. China, which already had nuclear weapons, and Pakistan, with which it had several conflicts. And after India lost a war with China in 1962, it became clear that nuclear deterrence could be the only way to prevent another defeat. So, a double strategy began. While they said everything was for peaceful purposes, they secretly began using foreign resources and technology to build a bomb. The most curious thing is that many of those resources came from countries like Canada and the United States, which had given them reactors and fuel, in theory only to generate electricity. India used part of that to build a bomb. In 1974, in the Rajasthan desert, they conducted their first nuclear test. They called it the Smiling Buddha. And the strangest thing is that they claimed it had been a peaceful nuclear explosion. Obviously, no one believed them. The world reacted with condemnation and sanctions because India had broken the agreements, used technology for military purposes, and had not signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, an international agreement that seeks to prevent the creation of more weapons of this type. For years, the country kept a low profile. They didn't say whether they had active weapons or how many, but they kept investigating. And in 1998, they no longer hid it. India carried out 5 new nuclear tests, this time clearly military. They included a much more powerful thermonuclear bomb than the previous ones, and made it clear that the country had a functional arsenal. Indeed, they adopted an official no-first-use policy, which means they would only use their weapons if they were attacked first. But this decision sparked an immediate reaction, because their neighbor, Pakistan, was not going to lag behind. They lost a war against India, which ended with the independence of East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh. The country was left fractured, defeated, and with a nuclear threat on the other side of the border. Then Prime Minister Zulfikar said a phrase that would mark the destiny of the country. "If India builds the bomb, we will eat grass or leaves, even go hungry, but we will make our own." And he meant it. When India carried out its first nuclear test in 1974, the Pakistani government launched a secret operation to catch up with them. They didn't have the resources or the technology, but they had Abdul Qadir Khan. This scientist worked at a uranium enrichment plant in the Netherlands. And while everyone trusted him, Khan stole top-secret plans on how to make nuclear centrifuges. Afterwards, he returned to Pakistan with all that information. That was the real beginning of Pakistan's nuclear program. But they were not alone. China, which also had tensions with India, decided to help Pakistan. He provided them with materials, guidance, and even plans for an atomic bomb. It was a strategic partnership. Arming Pakistan meant putting pressure on India from two fronts. Meanwhile, the United States watched but did not intervene. Why? Because they needed Pakistan as a key ally to fight against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So, even though they knew they were advancing their nuclear program, Washington looked the other way. Finally, in 1998, everything exploded, literally. India conducted 5 nuclear tests that year, including a thermonuclear bomb. And just 3 weeks later, Pakistan responded with 5 of its own detonations in the mountains of Rashko, officially becoming the 9th country with nuclear weapons. But their approach was different. While India adopted a no-first-use policy, Pakistan made it clear that it was willing to use its bombs, even if it wasn't attacked first. That detail set off alarms worldwide. And what's more unsettling is that, according to statements from Indian officials, this threat has been effective. India has avoided military retaliation in several conflicts for fear of provoking a nuclear attack from Pakistan. But that's not the end of the story. In 2004, Abdul Qadir Khan, the same scientist who stole the plans in Europe, confessed on television that he had sold nuclear technology to North Korea, Iran, and Libya, countries that are not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The world was stunned. Pakistan had not only developed its own bomb, but had also become an illegal exporter of nuclear secrets. Since then, Khan was placed under house arrest. Even though the government denied being involved in their actions, the stain remained forever. South Africa. For decades, nobody imagined that a country from the Southern Hemisphere could join the nuclear club. But South Africa had one of the largest reserves of natural uranium in the world. That detail alone already gave it an advantage. During the 1950s and 1960s, they began developing nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, exporting materials to powers such as the United States, United Kingdom, and France. But something changed in the 1970s, with Soviet influence increasing in Namibia and Angola, and the international isolation caused by the apartheid regime. South Africa began to fear for its survival. Without reliable allies and increasingly condemned in global forums, the country changed direction. It began secretly developing nuclear weapons. In 1977, it built a test site in the Kalahari Desert and was about to detonate a bomb. But a Soviet satellite detected it and alerted the United States. The international pressure stopped the test, at least officially. 2 years later, in 1979, a U.S. satellite detected a double flash in a remote area of the Indian Ocean, near the Prince Edward Islands. This event, known as the Vela Incident, remains a mystery, but many experts believe it was a joint nuclear test between Israel and South Africa. South Africa provided the location and secrecy. Israel provided the technology. Both were winning. By the mid-1980s, South Africa had already built 6 nuclear bombs, similar in power to the one dropped on Hiroshima. And although it never admitted to having them at the time, it maintained a deliberate policy of ambiguity, trusting that the mere suspicion of possessing them would be enough to deter any enemy. But then the world changed. With the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, the main communist threat disappeared. And in addition, apartheid was coming to an end. The white government knew that it would soon be replaced by a democratic administration. And here something unprecedented happened. Instead of transferring that nuclear power to the new government, South Africa made a drastic decision: dismantle all its nuclear weapons before the transition of power. They did it in secret. They destroyed the designs, sealed the enriched uranium in a vault, and hid everything. Only in the 1990s, with a new government, did the country publicly admit that it had nuclear weapons and had voluntarily eliminated them. It was the only country in history that made atomic bombs and then destroyed them on its own initiative. However, even after that, the danger did not completely disappear. In 2007, an armed group managed to infiltrate the facility where that uranium was stored. They were just a few meters away from stealing enough material for a dirty bomb before they were finally stopped. Today, South Africa is officially nuclear weapon-free. North Korea did not always seek nuclear weapons. In the 1960s, with the help of the Soviet Union, a program was started to generate nuclear energy, not weaponry. But over time, the regime saw something clearly. Having an atomic bomb was the best way to avoid being attacked. So they began to secretly work on converting that peaceful program into a military project. In 1994, they left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a direct signal that they wanted to manufacture weapons. Yes, in 2006 they conducted their first underground nuclear test. Although that first bomb was weak and possibly partially failed, they made it clear that they had already crossed the line. Since then, North Korea has conducted several more tests, each more powerful, and has also developed long-range missiles. Some of these missiles could, in theory, reach South Korea, Japan, Guam, and even parts of the United States. The regime says that all of this is to defend against foreign invasion, but it has also used these weapons as a strategy for international pressure. They threaten, test bombs, and then ask for negotiations or benefits. And even though the country lives in extreme isolation and with a very weakened economy, its nuclear program remains active and increasingly advanced. Today, nuclear weapons are the main reason no country dares to invade North Korea. They're his shield and also the foundation of his power. Don't forget to support this kind of content by subscribing and watching this other very interesting video that you will love.